You hear the term routine a lot, but the truth is it's never routine. Typically, when you respond to these types of complaints, it usually means either the person's out of town or they're deceased. In this case, we knew that he was not very mobile. In other words, he was sort of close to that community. You know, they go to work every day on time. They contact their loved ones on a daily or weekly basis, and when a person doesn't do that, we had a pretty good indication that something had happened to him. The truth is, we weren't prepared for what we found.
I woke up that morning and could hear someone beating on the wall or the door. Headed downstairs to find out what was going on, and there was a pretty large group gathered, and I figured that he'd gotten in trouble for having these animals.
But to us, it seems far more violent. The lizards incident was asserting dominance.
As the officer was peering into the apartment, they immediately noticed that there were what appeared to be large lizards roaming about inside of the apartment.
At first, the police saw Huff's lizards. And then, what they were feeding on.
I think shocking is a pretty good interpretation of what we found. It's a pretty harrowing experience for the officers at first because primarily we didn't know what killed this individual. We didn't know if there was something inside, some sort of exotic animal that was responsible for it.
We're not trained as far as lizards and knowing which ones are poisonous, which ones can hurt you, which ones are non-threatening. So it made it very difficult initially to conduct the investigation. But as we got closer and the evidence technicians began to take the photographs and look at him and examine the body a little bit closer, we realized that part of his facial region had been consumed. There was a lot of injury to his soft tissue. There was hands, his shoulders.
Jeff Wildonger, one of Huff's few friends, found himself face to face with his neighbor.
When the coroner and the medical examiner were working on Ron, they had the door open. It was such a graphic scene in my mind that I just felt like I had to try to get it out of my mind, maybe. So I just scribbled down a sketch of kind of what I had just been burned in my mind that day. His face was completely missing. You could see his molars up by his ears. His entire upper torso was just black from dried blood. His internal organs were strewn about. It was a horrific scene.
Due to decomposition and the other injuries that his body sustained, we were not able to get a clear picture of what he looked like. When I was able to obtain a photograph of him, I realized that he was an individual that frequented the same workout facility that I did. The one thing that makes it a little bit more difficult is, while I wasn't a friend of his, I knew him.
But the police were only just beginning to discover who Ron Huff really was. As the police searched the scene of Ron Huff's death, they uncovered evidence that revealed an unconventional character. Huff's family photos painted a portrait of a man who grew up with and loved animals. But somehow this had turned into an obsession. Huff had taken hundreds of photographs documenting his pets. Handwritten notes recorded the best way of feeding and caring for his animals. And thick files cataloged the natural history of lizards in the wild.
Ron talked passionately about his lizards, and the salespeople often called Ron Lizard Boy. Ron would laugh, and he accepted the name, and I think in some ways he was complimented by it.
Huff's obsessive knowledge of lizards seemed to define who he was.
There seems to be some characteristics shared by a lot of exotic animal owners of certainly knowing an awful lot about the animals in the wild, and there seems to be a compulsive aspect to owning animals, as well as to also identifying themselves with the animals, that often the animal seems to take over for the person's personality and be their kind of public persona to the outside world, and that without that animal, the person no longer seems to feel like they have a legitimate place in society.
In many ways, Ron Huff's obsession with reptiles was not unique. Here at Cincinnati Zoo, the former head of Reptiles understands that he and all those who work with these creatures are different.
My colleagues that I've worked with over the years, we are all unconventional by choice, I think. We have enormous egos, and I'm big enough to admit that. I have an enormous ego. We're introverted, but at the same time gregarious. We want to talk about the things that we're interested in, but we don't want to talk about anything else. You can see that the relationships that people who work with primates or cats or any mammal, those relationships are very different. They have emotional attachments to these animals, and they tend to view them as more as individuals, so it's as if they were part of your family. When you work with a large collection of reptiles, you may have 600 or 700 animals in your collection. You tend to view them as a species. You're interested in a particular species of reptile, not an individual reptile.
For a zoo professional to have so many reptiles in their care is normal. But an individual having an overwhelming number of pets can be an indication of the psychological condition known as hoarding.
Squalor often seems to be a prominent feature within animal hoarding. The waste of the animals, the containers for food, the bedding and whatnot. Often the lack of resources and funds lead people to keeping animals in their house or in their backyard, and their living space ends up mingling with the animals. He certainly shares a lot of the characteristics that are seen in the research for animal hoarders.
Instead of lizards sharing Huff's life, Huff shared theirs. They had taken over his home.
Mr. Huff had not been seen for 3 days when concerned relatives led the police to break into...
Whatever its cause, the relationship that Ron Huff had with his pets was, in the end, a fatal one.
Murder has been ruled out, but it is thought that an accidental death at his home could have led to him being consumed by his pets. Investigations are still being carried out to try and establish the cause of death.
The risks of animal hoarding are even greater when living with venomous reptiles, such as snakes. Within the reptile collection at Cincinnati Zoo is a snake that was confiscated from an owner in the city. Her name was Alexandria Hall. It's 2004. And Hall is on a journey to save her life.
Snake!
You got bit by a snake?
Snake bite.
Sit up.
Her pulse is racing. She is lightheaded and panicking. Adrenaline is coursing through her body.
Ma'am, you gotta lay back.
Once she had gotten bitten, it must have been shocking because you never expect that to happen. No one ever expects that to happen. You think it's always going to happen to someone else. But I can tell you from experience, when it happens, it's like having 2 red-hot needles jammed into your skin and having somebody hit your hand with a sledgehammer.
Route 2.
Hang in there. You got bit by a snake?
Route 2.
While being rushed into the emergency room, Alexandria Hall still had the presence of mind to tell her doctors what had bitten her.
So we knew that she had at least had 1 Arutu in her home, which is not a terribly large snake from South America. And in fact, their bites are not considered that dangerous. There's a fairly low mortality rate. So survivability from one of those bites is generally fairly high. But of course, in Brazil, there's antivenom for that species. You don't generally find it up here in the States.
The hospital treated her with a generic snake antivenom in an attempt to keep her alive. This Kentucky zoo is home to over 1,000 of the most venomous snakes in the world. It is open to tourists, but they are purely there to subsidize its real purpose, to produce the antivenom that can save victims of snake attacks.